Welcome to this explainer on Think and Thrive. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, honestly, incredibly frustrating psychological mystery. Why does trying to be absolutely perfect so often result in us failing entirely? I mean, if you've ever felt this, trust me, you are definitely not alone. It's one of the most common traps of the human mind, and yet it completely derails so many of us on a daily basis.
Just think about it for a second. Have you ever stared at a blank page, or maybe a brand new project at work, and you're so terrified of writing a bad first sentence or making the wrong move that you literally end up doing nothing at all? Hours just tick by, and instead of creating that masterpiece you envisioned, you're just paralyzed. You wanted to do it perfectly, but instead, you achieved absolutely zero. Well, except for maybe endlessly scrolling through your phone, comparing your behind-the-scenes struggles to everyone else's highlight reel, right?
So let's unpack this. This everyday frustration is what behavioral scientists and psychologists call the Perfectionism Paradox. Logically, you'd think that setting exceptionally high standards for yourself would naturally lead to exceptionally high achievement. But the paradox shows us that these best intentions to excel, well, they frequently backfire. They end up completely sabotaging our success, leading to worse outcomes, crushing amounts of stress, and this intense inner critic that just won't shut up. So what exactly is happening in our brains here?
To solve this mystery, we actually have to rewind all the way back to 1978. A researcher named D.E. Hamashek made this groundbreaking observation that totally shifted how we view perfectionism. He drew a line in the sand, dividing perfectionists into two distinct camps. He noted that normal perfectionists actually get a very real sense of pleasure from working hard and doing a great job. But neurotic perfectionists are quite literally unable to feel satisfaction. No matter what they achieve, no matter how hard they work, in their own eyes, it's just never, ever good enough. And this brilliant insight laid the groundwork for what modern psychology now calls the multidimensional model of perfectionism. Basically, we no longer view perfectionism as just one single sweeping trait. Instead, scientists split it into two different phases. On one side, we have adaptive perfectionism, which is often called perfectionistic strivings. This is your healthy, energized drive for excellence. On the flip side, we have maladaptive perfectionism, or perfectionistic concerns. This is that toxic, fear-based obsession with making mistakes and disappointing the people around you. Now, to really understand how these two sides dictate our behavior, we can look at a massive meta-analysis. This was conducted by researchers from the universities of Leeds, Sheffield, and York. They looked at data from a staggering 10,000 participants. They really wanted to figure out how these distinct dimensions of perfectionism directly trigger our worst, most self-sabotaging behavior, procrastination. When we map out the mind of a self-saboteur based on this data, a very clear psychological fingerprint emerges. The researchers found that chronic procrastination and maladaptive perfectionism, those toxic perfectionistic concerns we just talked about, share the exact same psychological profile. They both feature low conscientiousness, incredibly high neuroticism, and what psychologists call an avoidant coping style. In plain English, when things get tough or confusing or scary, their instinct is to just run away and avoid the problem entirely. But healthy perfectionistic strivings, that looks completely different. It features high conscientiousness and an approach-oriented coping style, meaning they tackle challenges head-on. We can understand the hidden mechanics behind this through what scientists call the cybernetic theory of self-regulation. Now, don't let the technical name intimidate you. It's really just a fascinating look at how your brain manages your goals. Here's how it works. First, you set a goal. Let's say writing a perfect report. Then you look at where you currently are, which might be staring at a blank screen. Your brain immediately notices this gap. Next comes the critical step, the expectancy assessment. Your brain rapidly calculates, do I actually have the skills, the time, and the energy to bridge this huge gap? If it says yes, you take action. If it says no, you withdraw and you delay.
And that brings us to the crucial point, the expectancy assessment trap. If you suffer from maladaptive perfectionistic concerns, your brain is constantly flooded with negative self-evaluations and extreme self-criticism. This actually tricks your brain. It biases your internal calculator into firmly believing that success is completely impossible. You look at the massive gap between your blank page and your perfect standard, you panic, you decide you can't possibly bridge it, and that triggers an overwhelming, almost physical impulse to just disengage. You abandon the goal entirely just to protect your ego from failing.
Let's look at how this plays out in the real world. There is a fascinating, highly specific workplace study on medical laboratory scientists in Poland. These are professionals whose everyday jobs absolutely require flawless, pin-drop precision because actual human lives are on the line.
But the findings here were a totally counterintuitive twist.
You would probably expect the maladaptive perfectionists to crack under that kind of intense pressure, right? Actually, the exact opposite happened. The adaptive perfectionists in these labs burned out much faster. Why? Because they exhausted all their internal energy constantly striving to achieve personal excellence and self-development. Meanwhile, the neurotic, maladaptive perfectionists surprisingly thrived. Because the lab environment had such strict, rigid external rules and procedures, it essentially shielded them from their own crippling doubts. The procedures made the decisions for them, completely removing that terrifying expectancy assessment gap. And we don't just see this at work. We see the perfectionism paradox wreak havoc in parenting, in romantic relationships, and even in therapy. Imagine a parent trying so hard to project a flawless family image to the neighbors that they miss out on genuine messy connection with their kids. Or consider someone going to therapy but trying to be the perfect patient. They are so focused on presenting an idealized image that they hide their actual real-world flaws from the therapist. This perfectionistic self-presentation totally destroys the therapeutic alliance. It creates a profound social disconnection, making true vulnerability impossible, which ultimately severely stalls their recovery and growth.
So, when perfectionists are visibly struggling, what usually happens? Well-meaning friends and colleagues almost always offer the exact same piece of bad advice. Hey, just lower the bar, take it easy, just relax. But as we've seen clearly from the research, changing your standards isn't the real solution here. The standard isn't the problem at all. It's your punishing psychological reaction to the standard.
So, let's translate all this science into real, practical solutions. Instead of just indiscriminately lowering your standards, behavioral science points to 3 actionable tips you can apply right now to decouple your high standards from that paralyzing fear of making mistakes. First up, we have to actively cultivate self-compassion. Now, this doesn't mean letting yourself off the hook or making excuses. It simply means responding to your personal failures with self-kindness rather than harsh, toxic self-criticism. Scientifically speaking, self-compassion downregulates negative moods. When you aren't constantly beating yourself up, your brain finally feels safe enough to maintain a healthy motivation. It allows you to keep trying after a failure, rather than just shutting down and procrastinating. Second, practice mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is essentially a non-reactive self-awareness. It allows you to look at that gap, the big, scary discrepancy between where you currently are and your ultimate goal, without instantly reacting with sheer panic. By just observing your thoughts without judgment, you drastically increase your task persistence. You can acknowledge, wow, I have a really long way to go on this project, without your brain triggering the alarm bells telling you to abandon ship.
As researchers, Stober and Otto concluded, perfectionistic strivings can actually be incredibly positive if we can just focus on doing our absolute best rather than agonizing over potential mistakes. The drive for excellence isn't your enemy. In fact, your high standards are a gift. The true enemy is the punishing self-criticism and the paralyzing fear that we attach to those standards.
So the next time you tackle a big project at work or face down a completely blank page, take a moment to ask yourself, are your standards pushing you forward? Or is your fear of falling short holding you back? Recognize the paradox for what it is, drop the self-criticism, and give yourself the permission to be wonderfully, humanly flawed as you strive for greatness. If you enjoyed exploring the psychology behind everyday life, subscribe to Think and Thrive for more evidence-based insights.